Okay, this is something that I find particularly interesting, and a lot of you probably will as well. What I have in the jar here are western, or as they're also known, red harvester ants. These are Pogonomyrmex barbatus species, and at last count, I believe, last I checked, there are about 28 different species and or subspecies of harvester ant. But these ants are common in western and southwestern states, particularly in the arid southwest. These ants are the primary wild dietary staple for our horned lizards, so I end up studying the harvester ants just about as much as I do the horned lizards themselves. But what I have here are some workers. As you can see here, these are worker harvester ants, and right there feeding on a piece of a squash here. This is an infertile queen. Those are known as winged alates, and an alate is a reproductive ant. Male drones have wings, and the infertile possible future queens are winged as well. And that is because after, in the spring and summer, after a rain shower or two, a nice rain shower, when the ground gets sufficiently soaked for digging, the drones and the future queens will take to a mating flight. They'll spawn and mate, and then they come down to ground. And unfortunately, the male drones, they don't survive very long because their mandibles are not sufficiently built to crack seeds and feed themselves. In the home colony, they rely on the worker ants to feed them. So the males, unfortunately, they pretty much quickly starve once they fly away from their home colony. The queens, the female winged alates, once they are fertilized, they will find a nice damp spot in the soil that looks like a good place, and they'll dig down a few inches, and they shed their wings because they won't be needing those anymore, and they lay their first brood of eggs, and they tend to them in this shallow nest and survive on their fat stores that they had prior to the mating flight, and also they digest the proteins from their flight muscles that they no longer need after they've shed their wings. And they tend to this first brood, and then when those ants are hatched, those first babies, they will start to forage and feed the queen, and they'll start to excavate the nest further, and they will continue on with that, and that's where you get these huge harvester ant nests. The queen just starts it out, and then from there on, her successive broods of workers will continue to dig the nest out, and it can take quite a long time for them to dig this nest out sufficiently and maintain it. These ants live a pretty good while in the wild. I've been able to keep these worker ants alive in captivity for 11 months previously, just a worker ant. And a lot of sources on the internet would say, in these ant farms, they'll tell you, worker ant, has a lifespan of about 3 months, maybe 6 months, but under ideal conditions, at least those that I've found, you can keep them alive about a year. And the harvester ant queens, it really surprises people, but they can live for anywhere from about 12 years to 30 years. They've been documented in the wild as living about 30 years. And they know this because they found the same harvester ant colony that they've documented previously. It's there decade after decade, and harvester ant colonies are a single queen colony. unlike fire ants and some other ant, species of ant, they have multiple queens, but the harvester ants don't. They have just one queen, and so when that queen dies out, eventually, sooner rather than later, I mean, the workers will carry on for some time, but eventually that colony will die out with the death of that queen. So they've been able to observe in the wild and document these harvester ant colonies that have been there in the same place decade after decade after decade. And so these queens are really long-lived in the wild anyway. And so what is really surprising to me here is that I had gathered these ants, most of them anyway, the queens and some drones that I had that have since died, but these were gathered last fall around August, if I recall, and we're in the first week of May now, so they've been here alive in this jar for quite a while, you know, about half a year already. And it was quite on accident, because if I'm out on an ant gathering trip and I'm out with my vacuum cleaners, and I will typically try to avoid vacuuming up the winged alates. I like to leave them be so that they can propagate in the wild, and there's two reasons for that. Number one, I want as many chances for harvester ants to propagate in the wild as possible, because they're the main food source for our horned lizards. And two, these harvester ants, although they're not often successful, they do compete with the imported red fire ants, the invasive type, and somewhat help to keep them at bay. If you have more harvester ant colonies around foraging for the food, it's going to tend to stifle any other type of ant, you know, an invasive ant like the imported red fire ants from moving in, so or at least slow them down. So anything that can help in that regard, you know, naturally, as opposed to a poison, I'm all for. So what I do is, if I've accidentally gathered up some of these winged alates in the vacuums, if I catch it soon enough, and I know that they got sucked up in the vacuum, I know the colony they came from, I'll put them back. But every now and then I won't see them. They'll just get sucked up in the vacuum. I won't notice it till I get home. And during the fall, it was really unusual to have those sucked up in the vacuum, because by that time they're usually done with their mating flights. And when they're getting ready for their mating flights, they're normally crowded around the entrance of the colony, kind of waiting for the right time to fly off. So I'll normally see them, and I can avoid them, go to another colony to do my gathering or whatnot. But in this case, they just, you know, I come home and they happen to be in the bin when I start looking. So I ended up putting them in the jar here. Kind of, it was supposed to be an interim measure, but then I get busy and I forget about things. But I put them in there with a little piece of moistened paper towel, and would give them food on occasion, and left some of the workers in there to kind of assist them, assist the winged queens there. But much to my surprise, just probably about a month or so ago, I realized that I actually had a fertile queen in there, and she was laying eggs. And let's see, I'm not sure if I'll be able to find her here, but I will try to point her out, or maybe pull her up. She's in there somewhere. She was laying eggs under the dampened paper towel here. But what the harvester ants like to do is they'll pile their trash and their dead up, you know, on the perimeter of their colony, and so they've got their little trash pile here, their compost, and some seeds that I fed them ended up making their way over there, and it looks like some of them are germinating. But these are very orderly ants, and there's a lot to admire about them. And they're tending to the eggs over here. It seems they're kind of shuffling eggs around. But let me see here. Where is that queen? I don't want to disturb them too much. I just saw her a short time ago, but it's really surprising to look in here one day and at the bottom of the jar under that paper towel notice a clump of eggs. So I knew right off, whoa, I got at least one winged queen in there that when they were in there last fall with when I still had some drones which were alive. Apparently I did have a mating inside the jar here. So but unfortunately I see only one queen since then that has shed her wings, and so I've only got one fertile queen out of there's probably a dozen other winged queens in there. So it's kind of a rare event to to find a fertilized queen, and then even rarer to have them in a captive setting like this, in a jar, and a mating take place, and you get a fertilized queen out of it. So let me just pick the jar up here momentarily. Let me see if I can find her. I'll pause the camera just for a second. Okay, here's our queen, and I had a little bit of trouble finding her because she was actually underneath a piece of sweet potato in there. She was munching down, and so she was underneath it, and I didn't see her. Otherwise, she's actually quite easy to find. You just look for the ant that's twice as big as the workers and who doesn't have the wings. And so this is my queen, and she's a really big girl. And hard to imagine that a queen ant like this can live anywhere from a dozen to 30 years. And I think that really has a lot to speaks a lot to their diet, what they're fed, their seed and plant diet primarily, and that's why I think they're such an important dietary item in the longevity of the horned lizards. It's contrary to popular misconception, it's not really any formic acid content in these in the venom of these ants, in my opinion, that that is key to the survival of the horned lizards. The requirement that they eat so many harvester ants, that would have some beneficial aspects, being that formic acid is a natural antibiotic and antiparasitic. It would lead to a lower gastric pH, which would kind of make the gastrointestinal system a little inhospitable to proliferation of internal parasites, and kind of keep pathogenic bacteria in check. But I really think, in my opinion, what is so necessary about these ants and the diet of horned lizards is the diet of the harvester ants themselves, the nutrients that the horned lizard derives from the ants because of the ants' diet, and then also it's because of the more unique digestive process. Horned lizards do not fully digest the ants they consume. They basically, the digestive, the bile from the horned lizard washes through the soft portion, the gaster of the ant, which is the abdomen there. That's where the nutrients are, and so the bile will kind of wash through that and basically leach the nutrients right out of the ant, and then when the horned lizard defecates, all that's left is a desiccated ant exoskeleton. So that's very efficient because it doesn't waste the horned lizard's hydration stores in the digestive process, and it doesn't break down this the very dense armor chitin that makes up the exoskeleton of the ant. Were the horned lizard to actually digest that very dense chitin as well, it would slow down its digestive processes and be much less efficient. And this is why I don't recommend for zoos or reptile hobbyists who are keeping horned lizards, legal or not, as pets. I don't recommend that they feed them a high proportion of crickets or mealworms or anything that doesn't suitably mimic their wild diet, which is high in ants, for that reason, because the chitin that makes up the exoskeleton of crickets and mealworms and other feeder insects like that, that chitin is much less dense than the ant. Ants are, if you think about it, their dense, hard exoskeleton here, they're a lot more armored, so to speak, than some of those other insects, like a cricket. So what happens is the chitin is less dense in the cricket, but because they're bigger, typically, they have a larger surface area, so that chitin starts to break down in digestion, and then it does slow the digestive processes of the horned lizard. So and that's true also for a lot of different reptiles, and why I will recommend to people to, for one, not overuse things like mealworms. They're just not that nutritious. And so where it concerns horned lizards, the best thing to do is approximate their wild diet as much as possible, and for that you have to have harvester ants. And if you can't do that, then in my opinion you have absolutely no business keeping a horned lizard. And also I'd just like to say, in my opinion, you really shouldn't be keeping them unless you're going somewhere, scientifically with it. I understand a lot of people, they have a soft spot for them, and they see one for sale in a pet store and whatnot, and so they get it. But really, they're such a hard keep in captivity that I really don't think, unless you're doing something to benefit research in that species or in the genus, I should say, because there are many species of horned lizard. But unless you're going somewhere with that that's going to benefit rehabilitation or any other type of study, then you really just should stay away from horned lizards as any kind of captive. But back to the topic of the ants here themselves, this is just what I find really just amazing, to have a fertile queen not only producing at this point in captivity, but for all appearances she was fertilized in captivity. And so what I'm going to do now is try to find a more suitable habitat for her and all the workers and everything that are helping her to this point, and try to set up a nice big environment for her to continue to produce, and see where it goes. It's going to be very interesting.